Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Daily Friends Show, the Tuesday edition. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by two of my esteemed colleagues, Ms. Sarah Gon. Sarah, how are you today?
I'm very well. I'm still got a little bit of the sort of relaxedness of holidays, so long may that last. I think probably until tomorrow afternoon.
Excellent news. And Mr. Marius Ruet. Marius, how are you today?
How's Nick? Good to see you back after holidays.
It's good to be back. Well, I mean, it's good to be back to a certain. I'd rather be here than anywhere else if I had to work, but I'd also rather be on holiday. If that makes sense. Right. So let's get started. Last night, of course, we had another. As someone, I don't know who, decided to start calling them family meetings, where President Cyril Ramaphosa speaks to the nation. Now, I'm sure we can whine about that a bit just now. But let's talk about what the president said. And he went into just kind of where we are with Corona at the moment and the second wave. He talked about that we're going to remain largely in level 3 lockdown. He announced that we're going to be closing our land borders over the holidays, and in the lead up to the holidays, there was enormous queues at some of the land borders around South Africa. I think Beitbridge had like a 4-day queue for trucks to cross, things like that. So there was a lot of fear that spread was being encouraged there, and so a lot of the land borders have now been closed. There would be people who would be exempt from the land border closure, which would be people transporting fuel, cargo, and goods, emergency medical attention for life-threatening conditions, the return of South African nationals, permanent residents, or persons with other valid visas, diplomats, and foreign nationals would be able to depart to neighboring countries. The president also said that the lockdown measures, including the ban on alcohol, would remain in place until the 15th of February. The other thing he talked about was concern about disinformation and conspiracy theories that have been going around about the COVID vaccine. And this is not unique to South Africa. We're seeing this all over the place. We've even seen it. Someone's ringing the bell at Sarah's house. We also have seen so on the vaccine conspiracy stuff. ANC Gauteng Secretary Jacob Kouwe said that we mustn't use Western vaccines, and the Congress of the COSATU Union President Zingiswa Losi also was raising concerns about potential side effects of the vaccines. And so it's saying that so far, I think of the couple million people vaccinated around the world, the number who have had side effects is in the sort of low hundreds, possibly lower than that. Which means that there's very little evidence so far that they are dangerous. But let me get started with you, Marius. What did you make of the president's speech? What did you make of what he was saying, the restrictions, the closing of land borders, and the conspiracy theories?
I didn't actually even watch it, to be honest with you, Nick. I didn't think he was going to say anything too interesting, so I just caught up with it afterwards on Twitter and on the internet. But as I say, I didn't think he was going to say anything earth-shattering. I mean, like somebody you thought they were funny on Twitter said that could have been an email, which they're probably right. But also, I think the closing of the land borders is another one of these things where the people who are going to suffer the most are poorer people. Because if somebody wants to go to Harare or Maputo or Gaborone or whatever the case is, they can probably afford a plane ticket. Somebody who doesn't have that kind of money, they'd want to go, they'd need to cross the border, they can't do it. And it's, standard, it's the poorer people who suffer. And also I think it's a bit disingenuous if the government was saying that because there are these 4-day-long queues at Beitbridge or whatever the case is, that means we need to worry about super spread events. Half the reason there were these massive queues there is just because the government can't ensure that crossing the border is an easy process. So that's why I was flipping 4-day-long queues. And also part of the reason was because a lot of Zimbabweans wanted to try leave because they were just about to go into 30-day lockdown. And obviously, most of Zimbabwe's problems are because of Zimbabwe itself, but also a lot of what's been happening in Zimbabwe and the problems there is because of South Africa's attitude to it and how it's propped up ZANU-PF since basically 2000. So I think a lot of the closing the borders is, again, it's kind of going for the symptom rather than the cause of these issues. And also, the beaches are still closed, which also doesn't make sense to me. I was never a fan of the beach closures, but I can kind of understand where the government was coming from. You don't want people congregating on the beaches, even though you allow them to congregate in malls and casinos and stuff, so it doesn't really make sense. But now the holiday season's over. Most people on holiday are back to wherever they live, back to Gauteng or whatever the case is, or back to, they've left the smaller towns and gone back to Durban or Cape Town, whatever the case is. So keeping the beaches closed makes absolutely no sense. And it's just, one of these things where, if you have these kind of nonsensical COVID regulations, then it's probably more likely people won't listen to the COVID regulation that kind of makes sense. So, the president said anything that surprised me too much last night, but just, more of the same. Some stuff that was sensible and some stuff that was pretty silly.
I was actually talking to the other thing, of course, is that taxis remain at sort of 100% occupancy, and I was talking to our colleague Gabriel Krauser this morning. Actually, he was telling me that he was driving through Joburg and he counted, I think, he stopped counting after 20 taxis that were completely overfull of people and had all the windows up, which is against what the sort of rules are supposed to be. So these regulations really aren't working out already, the ones that do exist, and also, like you said, they kind of really don't make much sense. I mean, big outdoor aired space like a beach, no, that's not acceptable. But everyone's allowed to go to the casino and gamble away their life savings. This is not very logical.
You can go to Rookie Lane and have an ice cream or whatever, but you can't go sit on the beach and look at the sea,
Right, it's a bit odd. As I think our colleague Cyril may have said on Twitter, the guidelines all say go outside, separate from people, and yet the only activities that aren't banned are indoor ones with crowded spaces.
And vitamin D is also very good for fighting this. And where do you get vitamin D from? The sun. So
right. Sarah, your thoughts? Also, I'd like to get your take on the vaccine conspiracy stuff. Sorry, you're still muted.
Right, because of the closure of the borders, I'm not sure if they're going to resolve that many of their problems, because there are large numbers of Zimbabweans who legitimately can come back into South Africa, and I'm not sure that this is going to do anything. I'm not sure to what extent it's actually going to alleviate Home Affairs' problems. Just to say one word on the beaches, is they've also closed the parks. Now, that is a source, you would not believe the source of irritation that presents to the other members of my family. And again, for the reasons you've both just stated, and that is, it's outside, you're not likely to have much in the way of super spreader or even spreader events. And it adds to the sense of sort of being locked up. With regard to the conspiracy theories, there's something about, in particular, vaccines that brings out the world of conspiracy theories against vaccines. That is hugely dangerous. I haven't researched it all that well. It certainly, as I recall, really goes back to the time when one doctor claimed that vaccines could cause autism, and they've had a bad rap ever since, even though that was proved completely wrong, and I think he was the medical equivalent of Despard. But I think in times of crisis and uncertainty and discomfort, people tend to fall back on conspiracy theories. But of course, this is very dangerous in this case, because if you ask people whether they would react the same way to a new and effective antidepressant or antihypertensive, they would probably say no. And vaccines are not very much different. There's always some risk, and what you're really doing is weighing up the risk against the benefits and deciding if it's worth it. So, we have to purchase the vaccines in anticipation that they will come through the tests and be regarded as safe enough. We really don't, particularly, just talking from our case, we don't have the luxury of waiting for something outside of the vaccines, because we've not handled it at all well, and we are going to rely on vaccines to push this crisis further out. But I do share the government's concerns on this. I mean, you end up seeing cell phone masts being burnt and destroyed because a belief has spread that 5G causes COVID. And there's some that say only traditional medicines will do the trick. And, I'm afraid I don't have sympathy. I do go with the prevailing science, and I think that the best thing you can do is make a decision based on the approaches and the research that is done by the most reputable and the widespread researchers.
Morris, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to say what the most ridiculous theory for me is that 5G causes COVID, because well known that 5G causes mad cow disease. So that's
that's right.
But I mean, on a serious note, CDP was also, I haven't looked at it in detail, but it seems like they were saying if you snort baby shampoo, that gets rid of COVID in your nostrils or something. I don't know. So and also the ANC Youth League has released a couple of posters on social media saying that you should eat Avo and, I don't know, nectarines or something. And they even say, remembering Manto Shabalala Msimang at the point.
Unless they have shares in Tito Mbowene's avocado farms.
Exactly. But I mean, you shouldn't laugh, because Manto Shabalala Msimang, she probably caused the death of quite a few South Africans. Her ridiculous thoughts around HIV/AIDS. So we shouldn't be, you shouldn't laugh about it. But it's, if you wouldn't be laughing, you'd be crying. So it's scary, this kind of like anti-science narrative.
Well, what's interesting is there's this whole anti-Western part to it. It's like a sort of, there's some of the more racial nationalist parts of the ANC seem to think, well, if it's made by white people, then it's going to poison us. I saw there's also an Ekurhuleni councillor for the ANC who said something like, the whites have all gotten vaccinated already and they're spreading COVID on purpose. Ekurhuleni, sorry.
Yeah, so he was in the East Lander.
Can I say they're talking about preferring vaccines from Russia and China. Now, the Russians we would probably consider white. The Chinese we would certainly not consider black. So that theory is problematic. And also the fact, of course, is that both are very authoritarian countries, so they don't have the court of public opinion to hold their feet to the fire in this respect.
I think really what seems to be going on here is the ANC is falling back on ideology. Just one more thing I want to say on this. A lot of, I think, the tension we're seeing now, I'm really coming around to the idea that a lot of the stress in society right now that's happening in South Africa, in America, all over the world, is directly caused by the virus. And I think there's good historical precedent for this. You can also look at the 1917 to 19 flu pandemic, which swept the world, which is, of course, the world's last big pandemic. And there we saw a lot of eerie echoes of today. There were anti-masking leagues, which were which held very aggressive protests against forcing the use of masks in public. There were people who also had lots of different theories that, shall we say, were not mainstream about what was causing the disease. In fact, I believe that people blamed radio instead of 5G for causing COVID, or not COVID, but H1N1, I think it was, the Spanish influenza. So, it's a little bit depressing sometimes, but also I think humbling to realize that we are human beings are sometimes very strangely predictable, and we are kind of repeating history. Any final thoughts from either of you?
Perhaps just to say that on a very serious note, one of the big problems with events like a pandemic is, of course, the conspiracy theories cover a wide spread of anti-Semitic thought. And that is very, very dangerous. And that sort of thing harks back to the Black Plague. So it's like the more advanced we are, the less advanced we are.
Yeah, I think this year, we're probably, at least the first half of the year, we're probably going to be talking about conspiracy theory quite a lot. Because it seems to have become a much bigger feature of world politics of late than it used to be. Like the stuff going on in the US is at least related to that. Anyway, let's move on to a story about somewhere else in Africa, which is, I think, just kind of an interesting case study about kind of where the world is at the moment. And that is Uganda is voting on the 14th of January in both a presidential and a parliamentary election. It's putting the very long ruling Yoweri Museveni, who's the current president, against 10 rivals, but the most important of which is a young pop star called Robert Kyagulanyi, who is widely known by his music nickname Bobby Wine. The current president of Uganda has been in power since 1986. He's 76 years old, and he's usually referred to as Jaja, which apparently means grandfather, one of the Ugandan languages. So his main opposition opponent, Bobby Wine, has accused the government of using security forces to spoil his campaign, breaking up rallies and beating entertaining supporters under the cover of COVID regulations. So a lot of the protesting has been a lot of the sort of rallies and stuff have been broken up by cops who've often used tear gas and in some cases live ammunition for allegedly breaking COVID rules and restrictions. Bobby Wine himself has actually been arrested a couple of times, but there's some reason to think that actually this is one of the first serious democratic challenges to the Ugandan president in a long time, and there's definitely some fear in the Ugandan government that they may lose the election to Bobby Wine. Marius, you've written a little news story about this. What's your take on things?
Well, I think it's quite interesting that I think it's becoming quite common around the world for autocrats to be challenged and what have you. But one of the problems is that a lot of these challenges often fail, and that's often because they're taking on not just the incumbents, but the entire apparatus of the state. And I think that's probably the case now with Mr. Wine and taking on Yoweri Museveni. We've also seen up to there were protests last year when Bobby Wine, I think he's been arrested twice now. The first time he was arrested, 50 people were killed. But
including having his car broken into by the cops. He was sitting in his car arguing with them, and they broke the windows and pulled him out through the window to arrest him. So quite rough stuff.
And so 50 people were killed by security forces over 2-day protests when Bobby Wine was arrested for the first time. So, and I'm sure we're going to see some shenanigans and fishy things going on. But I mean, Museveni is kind of a typical kind of African autocrat. He came in this blaze of hope, overthrowing a previous autocrat, Milton Obote, who'd himself overthrown a previous autocrat, was Idi Amin, who himself had overthrown Milton Obote the previous time. But kind of this blaze of hope, and people this is great. There's a new guy in charge. Things are gonna be different now. It's gonna be democracy. The economy is gonna grow, and then same kind of thing. Even though overall, Yoweri Museveni's done an okayish job on balance. Uganda's been fairly stable.
He's probably been Uganda's best autocrat. Not that that's a high bar to care.
But also, it's not like he's had. Ugandans are still very poor. We still had, some dodgy things happen there, like that Lord's Resistance Army insurrection of a couple of years ago, which is. If somebody's interested in that, they should go read about it. It's that's definitely worthy of a kind of a spy novel or a thriller novel. It's great. It was a guy who thought. He was, I don't know if he thought he was the son of God or God was talking to him. But anyway, he started this whole Christian army to take on the Ugandan government. It's all quite interesting, unless you're obviously one of the child soldiers involved there. But as I say, it's one of those kind of typical African story. Someone comes to power. We've seen it all over the world, or all over Africa. Robert Mugabe, Kenneth Kaunda.
But I think there's also there's a similar trend that we're seeing in a lot of African countries right now, where you're seeing a big rural-urban divide. So one of the things that seems to characterize Bobby Wine's support is it mostly seems to be from younger people and from people who live in cities. And I think that pattern is playing out also in South Africa and all over Africa, actually.
80% of Ugandans are under the age of 30, which is actually quite a statistic. So it tells you something. So you're going to have to wonder about how much what kind of voter repression there's going to be and so on, and who knows? How interested are young Ugandans in actually voting? They might consider something that's not really going to change things. But we'll see on Thursday. And sorry, just to something that I read over December, so we didn't talk about it, but it was Namibian local government elections were held in December, and there was also a very bloody nose for SWAPO, who's the governing party there. They normally get about 80% of the vote, and I think in this local government election, they only got about 55% of the vote. And they lost, for example, they lost most of the big cities. Windhoek went to an opposition coalition, but also, what is quite worrying, whites started to get scapegoated quite badly there.
There's a sort of EFF copycat type party in Namibia as
They're
well.
actually
that
Namibian
gained currency.
economic freedom fighters, but there's also guys called the Landless People's Movement who did pretty well.
Right.
They actually won a couple of regions, but what should be the in the governing party in SWAPO itself, there was scapegoating of whites and saying too many whites are voting, this is why we're doing badly, even though whites only make about 5% of Namibia's population. So they're not going to really make too much of a difference to the vote overall. So, and, a lot of people seem to think Namibia is like this really well-run place, but if you do a bit of digging deeper, like the economy is very fragile. They have a lot of the same kind of problems that we have, and they almost, maybe 2 or 3 years ahead of the curve of South Africa. They've already apparently brought in laws where they say X amount of the sector has to be made up of Black Namibians, for example, and that's something we want to bring in here, which is, even the apartheid government didn't, put in those kind of, the racial quotas in entire sectors, So, So, but anyway, to go back to the broader point, I think we might be seeing in Africa as a whole, we saw kind of a sea change in the early 90s, or there have been kind of two big, waves of change in Africa. Obviously, the decolonization movement in the 50s and the 60s, and I think then late 80s and early 90s with the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of their support for various dictators and tyrants, we saw, kind of flourishing of democracy around the continent, so not everywhere, but in, West Africa and Southern Africa, East Africa as well. So maybe, who knows, this could be maybe kind of a third wave of democratization or political change in Africa as, these kind of organizations or parties being charged for the past 20 or 30 years start seeing, actual being actually challenged at the ballot box.
Indeed. I would also like to point out quickly before we go to a slightly different topic that I looked up the manifesto of the Ugandan authoritarian president, Museveni, and it's actually far more pro-property rights in the ANC, which is, to me, quite
Not
amusing.
hard.
Anyway, no, not hard. But
it's not that hard, yeah. It's like being the tallest dwarf.
Yeah, I know, exactly. One of the things that's also happened in this Ugandan campaign, and I'm sure it's something that South Africa is going to experience, is that the government had a fight with Facebook. Facebook banned many government accounts in Uganda for allegedly encouraging the use of fake accounts, fake engagements, and sort of armies of trolls and bots and that kind of thing to try and shape perceptions in the election. Sarah, how do you think? It's not like Uganda is the only country where this is happening. Of course, Donald Trump got banned off Twitter, as we talked about a little bit yesterday. So that there's a similar fight playing out in the US. How do you think South Africa is going to fare when something like that happens?
Look, I think it's very likely that we're going to have that in our elections, particularly from the municipal elections onwards, because the ANC is looking increasingly fragile, and certainly Frans Cronje predicts that they will lose the majority by 2024, which is your classical 30-year period. We probably have the technological infrastructure to deal with it to an extent that other African countries may not have. But I can't help wondering whether entities like Facebook and Twitter don't rue the day when they pay no attention to how big they could become and just to what extent they could be abused and exploited. This is obviously, elections are fodder for this sort of thing. So it's going to have to be something that is watched very, very carefully. But you do need the guys with the technology to do it, because. If you look at as we've talked about, if you look at the conspiracy theories that have floated around the social media space, it's explosive. So I suspect this is something that's going to be an issue, and I'm not entirely sure how Facebook, etc., deal with it, because they are starting to come under pressure, particularly in the West, for deciding who is right and who is wrong politically on issues and banning people accordingly. So it's likely to be problematic for a while yet, and we are going to certainly have to deal with it.
Big tech looks like it's managed, at least in the West, to anger both left and right. And I guess my sort of next thought here is, which political party, which of the big three, do we think is going to be the first to run afoul of Facebook's sort of cracking down on fake accounts? My money would be on the EFF. Morris, your thoughts on this?
Oh, that's a good one. I think any of the three could actually probably be, probably DA is the least likely, but I wouldn't count them out. So But I mean, the ANC is probably one of the biggest resources, so they're probably the ones who've already got the server farm full of polls set up and ready to go. So just on another note, talking about the local government elections coming up, I saw that the IEC has actually written to, I think it was the electoral court, and asked if they can postpone the January and February by-elections because there are restrictions of gatherings down level 3. So if you can't gather and have political gatherings around, this is obviously a restriction on your political rights. That means you can't have by-elections. So I think just something to watch going for the big local government election, which we're going to have before November this year. I mean, that could be, who knows, could it be used as a reason to postpone the elections? I mean, I don't think it will. I think it's getting ahead of myself if we start thinking that way, but I think it's something to watch.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something to be concerned about. I would not be surprised. They would probably need the support of the EFF in Parliament, though, for the ANC to postpone this election.
Look, and I mean, postponing the election itself is not necessarily it doesn't mean we're suddenly under a dictatorship, but it's just something, I mean, the government's proved that's not really all that trustworthy. So if they say we're going to just postpone the election for a month like they did in New Zealand, where, the New Zealand government's probably a bit more trustworthy than ours, say, okay, cool, we'll be voting in a month, which they did do. I mean, if the ANC said we postpone the local government election for a month, who would be prepared to put 100,000 rand on that you'd be voting in a month's time?
Well, I think the real fear is that they go forward with syncing it up with the national election, which is something the ANC's talked about wanting to do for a long time, having local government, provincial, and national elections all on the same
which would be a disaster.
Which would not be good, and it also would mean that the thing would be extended until 2024 or something, which would not be good. Right, let's move on to our last topic for today, which is a somewhat amusing story out of the US. Not terribly important, but worth a chuckle. On the 3rd of January, Representative Emmanuel Cleaver of the American House of Representatives was he was closing a prayer marking the end of the 117th Congress in the US. He's a 37-year-old. He's been a pastor at a Methodist church and a senior pastor of the St. James United Church in Kansas City for 37 years. And he ended his prayer thus: "And dare I ask, O Lord, peace even in this chamber now and evermore. We ask it in the name of the monotheist God, Brahma, and God known by many names, by many different faiths. Amen and our woman." Sarah? I'm not familiar with our woman.
What I think this is slightly serious is the fact that it's part of the woke, inclusive nature of the politics of the Democrats to a greater or lesser extent. It also says terrible things about the good Reverend that, he should understand the origins of Amen and the fact that it has absolutely nothing to do with men. Its origins are in Hebrew for certainty, truth, or so be it, and they filter down through Greek and Latin to Old English and on. A Republican representative in the House said something to the effect of that it's not a gendered word. Unfortunately, facts are irrelevant to progressives. Unbelievable. But I did rather like the New York Post's headline, which read, "Ah, women, oy vey." So, but this comes in, literally in the same week that Nancy Pelosi and one of her colleagues proposed that the House rules of the House of Representatives cease to use anything that's drafted in relation to them. Would no longer use the words parent, would no longer use rather the words mother, father, son, daughter, brother, or sister. Seaman would become seafarers, and himself, herself would become themself. I'm really curious to see what the documents are going to look like. I don't know. I think the Democrats are losing it sooner than we think. But I guess what can I say to that other than our women to that, sibling?
Yeah, I must say, there's something that really makes me uncomfortable, which is a sort of politically driven changing of words. I think that language tends to be quite an organic thing. And I'm not a big fan of having sort of this ham-handed, we need to change words so it fits with the time. Because with the speed of change now, in 20 years, all of this will be outdated anyway, and people will be called bigots for using these words. Exactly. Final sort of 30 seconds, Morris?
I think it's always good if you try to include people and, and make language less exclusionary. But I mean, I think this is kind of thing where I don't want to use the term lightly, but it's political correctness gone mad.
Yeah.
So a man it's not a gendered word, and saying a man or a woman is just, just makes the person look foolish. And actually, people who actually trying to, make language a bit more inclusive just makes them look foolish as well. People are like, oh, whatever, you're just one of these weird guys who wants to say woman instead of a man.
I think it speaks a lot to the historical illiteracy of a lot of the work people, that they really often just don't know where these words come from. But that's a discussion for another day. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we will see you tomorrow for the next episode of The Daily Friend. Have a great week, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow.